the most feared mafia boss in the city, was in the middle of a meeting when a little girl walked straight up to his table. No one stopped her. That alone was enough to make the room uneasy. The restaurant, usually filled with low murmurs and clinking glasses, fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. Armed men stood frozen. Eyes shifted nervously between the child and the man at the center of it all. He didn't look at her at first. He was too busy signing a deal that would decide someone else's fate. But then she spoke. Soft, clear, unshaken. My mom died waiting for you. The pen slipped from his fingers. It hit the table with a sharp crack that echoed louder than it should have. Now he looked at her. Really looked. She was small, fragile, dressed in clothes that had seen better days. But her eyes didn't belong to a child. They carried something heavy, something old. His men reached for their weapons, waiting for a signal. It never came, because for the first time in years, the man who made others tremble sat completely still. Breath shallow, chest tight, as if those 8 simple words had done what no enemy ever could, found a crack in him and torn it wide open. His name was Cale Draven. He ran the Draven Syndicate from the shadows of Bogota, Colombia. He owned buildings, men, and silence. He had walked through fire and called it business. But right now, facing this small girl standing alone in his restaurant, he didn't know what to do next. And that scared him more than anything ever had. Her name was Amara. But Cale didn't know that yet. All he knew was that she had walked through 2 sets of armed guards, past a locked side corridor, and straight into the most dangerous room in Bogota, without a single person laying a hand on her. That wasn't an accident. His head of security, a thick-necked man named Roll, appeared at the edge of the room with a face full of confusion and no explanation. Cale looked at him once. Roll dropped his eyes to the floor. That would be dealt with later. For now, Cale's attention stayed on the girl. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She stood with her feet together and her small cloth bag held in front of her with both hands, like she was waiting outside a school office. His lieutenant, Bash Kuro, stepped forward slowly. He was a calm man by nature, big, quiet, and difficult to read. But even Bash moved carefully, the way you move around something you don't fully understand. Little one, Bash said, keeping his voice low and steady. How did you get in here? The girl didn't answer him. She was still looking at Cale. Only Cale. Like he was the only person in the room who mattered. And somehow, in a way Cale couldn't explain, that was the most unsettling thing of all. She had walked into a den of armed men without a single sign of fear, because she hadn't come looking for safety. She had come looking for him. Specifically, deliberately, like she had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Cale dismissed the room with one look. Not a word. Not a gesture. Just a slow, steady glance around the table that told every man exactly what was expected of them. Chairs scraped back. Footsteps moved toward the exits. The business associates gathered their papers and left without a single question. They knew better than to ask. Within 60 seconds, the restaurant was empty. Every table vacant. Every corner cleared. The only sounds that remained were the low hum of the kitchen and the quiet shuffle of the girl's worn shoes as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Bash stayed by the door, arms folded, watching. Cale leaned back slowly in his chair. He studied the girl the way he studied every unknown thing that entered his world, with patience and a mind already working through every possible angle. How old are you? He asked. 8, she said. Where are you from? Kumasi, Ghana. How did you get to Bogota? Bus. Every answer came without hesitation. No stumbling. No searching for words. She had prepared for this conversation many times over. That told him something important. This gal had not wandered in here by mistake. Cale let the silence stretch before he spoke again. I don't know who your mother is, he said carefully. And I don't know who sent you here. But whatever story you've been given, it's the wrong one. He meant every word. He told himself he meant every word. But there was something in her eyes, some deep, unblinking certainty, that made the words feel hollow before they even left his mouth. Imara didn't argue. She didn't cry or plead or raise her voice. She simply reached into the cloth bag on her shoulder and pulled out something small, wrapped in a soft piece of faded cotton. Her hands were careful, The kind of careful you only use with something irreplaceable. She unwrapped it slowly. A photograph, old and worn at the edges, folded once down the middle with a crease that had been opened and closed so many times the paper had softened along the fold like worn cloth. She walked to the table and placed it flat in front of Cale. Then she smoothed it down with both palms, gently, deliberately, the way you do when you've rehearsed something in your head 1,000 times. Cale looked down, and something happened to his face. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sharp gasp, no sudden movement. It was quieter than that. A shift in the muscles around his jaw. A stillness behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. Like a man who had just stepped into a room he thought was locked, and found the door already open. Bash saw it from across the restaurant. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched his boss stare at that photograph the way you stare at something you thought you had buried, only to find it standing right in front of you, alive and impossible to look away from. Cale's hand moved slowly toward the photo, then stopped, as if he wasn't sure he was ready to touch it, as if touching it would make it too real to survive. The woman in the photograph was laughing, not posing, not smiling for a camera, laughing, with her whole face, the way some people do when they have forgotten to be careful. Her head was tilted slightly back. Her eyes were half closed with joy. She was standing in front of a yellow door. Behind her, red earth stretched toward a line of green trees. The sky above was wide and pale blue. It was somewhere in Ghana. He recognized the look of the light. He hadn't let himself think about that country in years. Or that door. Or her. Her name came back to him slowly. Not like a memory rushing in, but like something rising from deep water. Heavy, quiet. Adana. He hadn't said it aloud in over a decade. He had trained himself not to. He had packed it into a place inside himself where he kept everything that could no longer be useful. And he had left it there. He had told himself she was fine. That she had moved on, built a life, met someone, forgotten him the way people forget things that cause them pain. He had told himself that over and over, in the early years when it was hard, and in the later years when it became just a dull, distant ache he no longer examined. He had believed it, too, until now. Now he was staring at her face in a photograph held by an 8-year-old girl standing alone in his restaurant. And he understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his chest, that he had been wrong about all of it. Cale finally looked up from the photograph. Imara was still standing at the edge of the table. She hadn't sat down, hadn't been offered a seat. She stood the way she had stood since she walked in, straight, quiet, patient, like she had all the time in the world and knew it was about to be used. "Sit down," Cale said. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't cruel. It was just the way he spoke, flat and direct, like every word cost something. Imara pulled out a chair and sat today. Bash moved quietly to the side, then returned with a glass of water and a plate of food from the kitchen. He set them in front of her without a word. Imara looked at the food for a moment, then back at Cale. She folded her hands on the table. "Tell me," Cale said. And she did. She started at the beginning. She spoke the way children speak when they have rehearsed something painful so many times that it no longer makes them cry. Slowly, steadily, with no emotion on the surface but everything underneath. She told him about the house in Kamazi, a small house with 2 rooms and a garden her mother kept tidy even when everything else was difficult. She told him about the yellow door, the same door in the photograph, and how her mother never repainted it. Not once. In all the years Imara could remember, that door stayed yellow. She never explained why. She never had to. Even as a small child, Imara had understood. The yellow door was not just paint. It was her mother keeping a promise to someone who wasn't there. Every night, Adana told her daughter a story. Not the kind you find in books, about kingdoms and animals and things that never happened. These were real stories. True stories. Stories about a man. She never called him by his full name. She simply called him the one who would come back. She said it the same way every time. Not with bitterness, not with sadness, but with the calm certainty of someone who has made up their mind and refuses to be moved. She told Imara how they had met, how he had made her feel safe when nothing around them was safe, how he had looked at her like she was the only still thing in a world that wouldn't stop moving. She told Imara he hadn't left because he stopped loving her. He had left because he was afraid. Afraid of what his world would do to her if she stayed too close. Imara had listened to these stories every night for as long as she could remember. Some nights she believed them completely. Some nights, when the electricity went out and the house felt very empty, she quietly wondered. But she never said that to her mother, because when Adana told those stories, her eyes became the most alive they ever were. And a child knows better than to blow out the only light in the room. Kale sat very still as Amara spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He just listened, with the expression of a man hearing his own name spoken in a sentence he never expected anyone to say out loud. Each word landed on him like something he deserved. The waiting had cost Adana everything. Not all at once. It came slowly, the way hard things usually do, like water finding its way through stone. A crack here, a loss there. Small pieces of a life worn away by time and hope, and not enough money and too much love. She worked long hours at a small clinic on the edge of the city. Double shifts most weeks. She was good at her job, careful with her patients, patient with the difficult ones. Her co-workers respected her. Some of them loved her. But she never left Kumazi. Every time a new opportunity came, a hospital position in a better city, a chance to start fresh somewhere else, she turned it down quietly. Because Kumazi was where he knew to find her. And so she stayed. She kept the house. She kept the yellow door. She kept a small photograph of him hidden inside the pages of a book she read every evening. A book so worn by now that the cover had separated from the spine. She raised Imara on almost nothing. But somehow it was enough. Imara was fed, clothed, and in school. She wasn't given everything. But she was never made to feel like she was missing it. That was Adana, making something out of nothing. And still, every evening, she would sit by the window that faced the road, not for long, just a few quiet minutes, and watch. Like she was waiting for someone to come around the corner. Like she was absolutely sure, one day, they would. The memories came without permission. Kale hadn't thought about that night in years. He had buried it carefully, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. And a man in his position couldn't afford things that mattered too much. But now, sitting in the quiet restaurant with a photograph in front of him, the past broke through like water through a dam. 12 years ago, he had not yet been who he was now. He had been younger, harder in some ways, softer in others. He was climbing fast through the underworld, building connections, making enemies, taking risks that made older men shake their heads. And somehow, in the middle of all of that, he had found Adana. She was studying nursing at the time. She lived in a small flat and spent her evenings reading by lamplight. She was nothing like the world he moved through. Careful where he was reckless, warm where he was cold. She was the only person in his life who made him want to be something different. And that was the problem, because the more she mattered to him, the more danger she was in. His enemies had eyes everywhere. It was only a matter of time before they noticed her, before they used her against him. And so one night, without warning, without a proper goodbye, he made a decision. He held her face in his hands and said the words he believed in that moment. "I'll come back for you. I promise." Then he walked out of her door. He didn't look back. Not once. He had told himself it was the right thing. In the weeks that followed, he had built a wall around that decision and refused to examine what was on the other side. He had an empire to build, enemies to manage. Feeling things had never been part of the plan. But on certain nights, quieter nights, when the city was still and there was nothing left to distract him, he thought about what he had said to her. "I'll come back for you. I promise." He had held her face in his hands when he said it. He had meant it the way you mean things in the moment before the world presses in and reminds you what you are. He had meant it, and then he had never come back. Imara's voice pulled him back to the present. She was still talking, quietly, steadily, and she had reached the part of the story Kale had been dreading without knowing it. She told him about the promise. Not his promise. Her mother's. Adana, in all those years of waiting, had never told Imara to stop believing. She had never said he wasn't coming, or that they needed to move on, or any of the things a person might reasonably say after enough time had passed. Instead, she kept the yellow door the same color. She kept the book with the photograph inside. She kept the window unblocked. And she kept the promise alive, not for herself anymore, for Imara, so that her daughter would understand. Love, when it is real, does not expire, even when the person you're waiting for doesn't come. She got sick 2 years ago. Imara said it simply, like she was reporting a fact rather than tearing something open. Kale didn't move. At first it wasn't bad. She was tired a lot. She lost weight. The doctors at the clinic, the same clinic where she worked, they told her what it was. They said it could be treated. Imara paused, but the treatment cost money. She looked down at her folded hands for a moment, then back up at him. She had some savings. Not much. She used most of them to hire a man, a private investigator. She paid him to find you. Kale felt something cold settle in his chest. He took the money, Imara continued, her voice still even. And then he stopped answering. She never heard from him again. The table was very quiet. Bash, standing by the wall, had not moved in several minutes. Imara continued. After that, there wasn't enough money left for the treatment. She tried to work more hours, but she was getting weaker. The doctors told her she needed to rest. She didn't listen. She paused again. She kept saying you would come, that when you came, things would be different. Kale stayed at the photograph, Adana laughing in front of the yellow door. Healthy, alive, full of light. He had done this, not by raising a hand or pulling a trigger. He had done it by leaving, by keeping his silence, by convincing himself that disappearing was the same as protecting someone. It wasn't. It had never been. In her last weeks, she couldn't work anymore. Imara's voice was softer now, not because she was losing control, but because the story had reached its quietest, most painful part. She stayed home. Sister Yolanda, the old woman next door, she came every day. She brought food. She helped with the house. She sat with my mother in the evenings so she wouldn't be alone. Kale listened without speaking. My mother moved her chair to the window, the one that faces the road. She said she just wanted to see outside, but we both knew what she was watching for. The restaurant around them was completely still. Even the sounds from the kitchen had gone silent. She got much weaker in the last 2 weeks, but she never asked us to close the curtains. Not once. The light came through every morning and she would sit there. Some days she slept in the chair. Some days she was awake, and she would hum to herself, soft and low, a song she never taught me the words to. Imara stopped for a moment, swallowed once, continued. She was still watching the road on the last morning. I sat with her. I held her hand. She smiled at me, the kind of smile that feels like a goodbye even before you understand what goodbye means. She looked directly at Kale, and then she was gone. Kale said nothing. There were no words. There was only the sound of a man sitting inside the wreckage of choices he made 12 years ago, and feeling every piece of it land. Adana had known the end was coming. She hadn't said it in those words. She was not a woman who spoke of death directly when there were better ways to say things. But she had prepared. 3 days before she died, she had called Imara close. She was lying in bed by then, too weak to sit in the chair by the window. But she had asked Sister Yolanda to pull back the curtains before leaving for the evening, so the last daylight could still reach her. She had taken Imara's hand, and she spoke very slowly and very clearly, the way adults speak to children when they need every word to land exactly right. She told Imara there was a man, the man in the photograph. She said his name was Kale, and that he lived somewhere far away, and that he was not an easy man to find. She told her to look for a place called Nero's, a restaurant in a city called Bogota. She said someone in Medellin would know the name. Then she said something Imara had repeated to herself every single day since. Tell him I waited, and tell him I forgive him. She made Imara say it back 4 times. Then she touched her daughter's face and told her to be brave. Imara told her she would. Adana closed her eyes to rest. She never fully woke up again. Kale pressed his hand flat against the table. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the room, somewhere 12 years away, where a woman had spent her last breath making sure her daughter could find the man who never came back. Adana's funeral was small. The clinic staff came. Some neighbors. Sister Yolanda, who cried through the whole service and then went home and made enough food for 20 people because she didn't know what else to do with her grief. Imara stood through the entire funeral without crying. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she had made her mother a promise, and promises like that require you to stay strong even when your chest feels like it's caving in. She stayed with Sister Yolanda after the burial. The old woman had opened her home without being asked, cleared out a room, and told Amara to stay as long as she needed. She was kind in the quiet, steady way that some people are, without making noise about it. But Amara had not stopped thinking about what she needed to do. She had watched her mother wait her whole life. She was not going to wait. She spent 3 months asking questions, listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, following small pieces of information the way you follow a thread through a dark room, slowly, carefully, without letting go. A clinic visitor mentioned a man with connections in South America. That man mentioned Medellin. A street vendor in Medellin, when she described who she was looking for, had lowered his voice and said one word: Nero's. She had gone back to Sister Yolanda's flat that evening. She had packed a small bag. She had taken the money set aside for her school fees, and she had left before sunrise. The bus from Medellin to Bogotá took 6 hours. Imara sat by the window with her bag on her lap and the photograph inside it, wrapped in the same cotton cloth her mother used to keep it safe. She had rehearsed what she was going to say for the entire journey, not because she was afraid of the words, but because she had promised her mother she would say them right. She practiced the tone, calm, clear, no shaking in her voice, the same way Adana had taught her to speak when something important needed to be said. "My mom died waiting for you." She said it quietly to herself, watching the mountain roads roll past outside the window. She said it again and again, until it stopped hurting. When the bus reached Bogotá, she asked a woman outside the station if she knew a restaurant called Nero's. The woman looked at her with an odd expression, a small girl, alone, asking for a name most adults said carefully and not in public. But she pointed in the right direction. Imara walked 40 minutes through streets that grew quieter and more serious the further she went. When she reached the building, she stood outside for a moment. She looked at the dark glass front, the suited man near the entrance, the 2 others positioned further back. She felt fear, but she had felt fear before. She straightened her back, tightened her grip on her bag, and walked forward. The guard stepped into her path. She walked around them, and she didn't stop until she was standing in front of the only man in the room who mattered. Kale was no longer sitting. At some point during Amara's story, he had stood and walked to the window. He stood there now with his back to the room, looking out at the city below. Bogotá moved the way it always did. Taxis and noise and thousands of people who had no idea that in a restaurant above the street, something was quietly falling apart. He had survived assassination attempts. He had lost men he cared about. He had made decisions that cost lives and filed them away because that was what the work required. He had built an empire from blood and silence, and he had told himself 1,000 times that it was worth it. Now a child of 8 had walked into this room and reached something no bullet had ever touched. He thought about Adana by the window, watching the road, waiting, getting weaker, still waiting. He thought about the money she had spent trying to find him, money meant for medicine, given to a man who disappeared. He thought about the clinic, the doctor's words she must have heard and tried to find a way around. He thought about the yellow door, still yellow, after 12 years. His throat tightened in a way he hadn't felt since he was young. He had told himself he was protecting her. He had been protecting himself from attachment, from responsibility, from the terrifying possibility of loving something so much that losing it would break him. And she had paid for that choice with her life. While he stood here, building his empire and feeling nothing, he turned around. He walked back to the table slowly and stood at the end of it, looking at Amara. She looked back without flinching. For the first time since she had walked in, he truly studied her face. Not for threat, not out of caution. He looked at her the way you look at something you are only now allowing yourself to see. The shape of her eyes, the way she held her chin up even as her lips carried a slight tremble she was working hard to control. That particular stillness she had, a quality of waiting calmly inside difficult things that had no place in a child and every place in the woman he had once known. He did the arithmetic. It moved through him like cold water. He pulled out the chair and sat directly across from her. His elbows rested on the table. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. "When is your birthday?" Imara told him. "Month, day, year." Each one landed separately. "Month, day, year." The silence that followed was unlike anything that room had ever held. Longer than any standoff. Heavier than any negotiation. Bash, standing across the room, closed his eyes for a brief moment. He had already done the calculation himself. He had known since he first looked at the girl's face. He had been waiting for his boss to reach the same place. Kale stared at Imara. Imara stayed back. She didn't look afraid. She looked like she had been waiting for him to understand all along. Kale stood up again. He didn't know where to go. There was nowhere in this room, in this city, far enough from what he had just understood. But he moved anyway, because standing still felt impossible. He was Imara's father. The words existed in his mind but hadn't reached the rest of him yet. They were there, clear and undeniable, but the full weight of them was still arriving, the way the sound of something falling reaches you a moment after you've already seen it hit the ground. He had spent 12 years building something. The Draven Syndicate had operations in 3 countries. He controlled supply lines that governments couldn't trace. Men feared his name in cities where he had never set foot. He had power that most people didn't even know existed. And while he was building all of that, Adana had been alone. Adana had been sick. Adana had spent her last savings on a man who was supposed to find him, and died hoping he would walk through the door before the end came. She had raised his daughter on a nurse's salary and a broken promise. She had kept a yellow door painted the same color for 12 years. She had never stopped believing he would come back. He had, just too late. He pressed his fist quietly against the wall. Not hard. The gesture of a man who has simply run out of room inside himself for what he is feeling. Bash stood in the corner and watched his boss become someone he had never seen before. A man with no walls left. The threat came that evening. The business associates had long since left. The kitchen staff had been sent home. The restaurant sat in quiet half-light, a single overhead lamp burning above the table where Imara had fallen asleep in her chair, her small bag still on her shoulder, her head tipped gently to one side. Bash had draped his jacket over her. He stood by the door, not saying much. Vince Olin entered through the back corridor. He was always a careful man, well-dressed, measured in how he spoke, never saying directly what he meant when an implication would do. He was Kale's senior enforcer, and in all the years he had worked inside the syndicate, he had watched Kale operate without a single personal weakness. Tonight, that had changed. Vince kept his voice low and stood a respectful distance from the sleeping girl. "I think you know what I'm going to say." Kale looked at him. "A child in the picture changes things," Vince said. "It becomes something people can use. Something that makes you reachable." He paused carefully. "There are ways to handle this quietly. Arrangements that—" "Leave," Kale said. Vince stopped mid-sentence. "Leave the building," Kale said. "Tonight." Vince studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the slow, controlled nod of a man storing information for later use. He turned and walked out. Kale stood alone in the near dark, watching the small rise and fall of Imara's breathing. He had walked away once before. He was not going to do it again. Morning came quietly through the windows of Nero's. Pale light moved across the floor and reached the edge of the table where Imara still slept. The city outside had only just begun to stay. Kale had not slept. He had sat in the chair across from her through the entire night, watching the darkness slowly turn to gray, then gray to light. He had made no plans, run no calculations. He had simply sat there, present, still, the way you sit with something enormous when you have finally stopped running from it. When Imara opened her eyes, he was there. She looked at him without surprise, as if some part of her had always known he would stay. He slid the photograph across the table toward her. She looked down at it, then at him. "She wanted you to have it," Imara said quietly. "I know," he said, "but it belongs with you." Imara picked it up. She held it for a moment, looking at her mother's face, the real laugh, the yellow door, the open sky. Then she placed it carefully back in her bag. Kale came around the table. He lowered himself to one knee in front of her, not as a gesture, not as performance. He knelt the way a man kneels when there is nothing left to hide behind and nowhere left to run. He looked at his daughter. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything she went through. For everything you went through. I'm sorry I wasn't there." Imara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her small hand on top of his. Outside, Bogota was waking up. And inside Nero's, the most feared man in the city, made the only choice that had ever truly mattered. Not power.